to today's session where we're going to be focusing on supporting your dyslexic child with their reading. So we know there's lots of reasons why dyslexic children might struggle with reading and have some barriers around that. So what we're going to explore in today's session is some of those reasons, some of which you'll probably understand very well in terms of your child and their difficulties with reading, but there may also be some other things that you haven't considered yet in terms of the reasons why they're experiencing challenges. March shows us World Book Day, and so we felt we would be a great opportunity to tie in with that in terms of looking at supporting with reading at home. So after we've explored some of the reasons why your dyslexic child may be struggling with reading, may have some barriers around that, we will look at some suggestions as to how we can support with that at home. So that is sharing our experience and our knowledge of dyslexia and the reading process. I'm going to move to share my screen now. And as I say, what we're going to do to begin with is start off by looking at some of the reasons why your child might be struggling with reading. So often there are some common challenges that dyslexic children face around reading. The first one is to do with their reading skills. So there are lots of areas of reading that may be a challenge for dyslexic learners, and we're going to have a look at just some of those now and why that is, and give you a bit of extra understanding around that. So for a lot of dyslexic learners, decoding new words is a real challenge. And what we mean by that is when they come across a word they haven't seen before, breaking that word up, sounding it out, and being able to accurately blend those sounds back together to read it. And there are lots of skills involved in that. So we're including phonics skills there in terms of their knowledge of what sound the different letters make, or the different groups of letters. We're also expecting them to be able to break up longer words and recognise patterns of letters, groups of letters, and have skills to be able to do that. And for a lot of dyslexic learners, that can be really difficult in terms of a process. Dyslexic learners often also have difficulties with recognising what we call common words. Those are the words that we might see more frequently, such as small words like and, the, by, but also more common words like because, friend. So those are ones that typically aren't as easy to sound out, and the sounding out process, the phonics, is less likely to be successful with those words. So we need to have some different strategies for being able to recognise what those words are. And lots of dyslexic learners will find it hard to remember those with consistency. They might get them mixed up, and that can be difficult and make it reading challenging for them. And what both of those things mean is that often reading comprehension is hard for dyslexic learners. So understanding what they're reading can be a challenge. Taking meaning from what they're reading can be a challenge, because if they're struggling to read some of the individual words, it makes sense that it's going to be hard for them to understand it. What also can get in the way of that process is some of the cognitive processing difficulties that a lot of dyslexic learners will face. So, for example, if a learner is reading something and comes across the word that they don't know, they're going to stop and try to work out what that word is. And there's lots of skills involved in that, but there's also lots of cognitive processing that goes into that in terms of using, for example, their working memory to think about what strategies they've got for breaking up that word, for sounding it out, and for trying to keep hold of what they've already read in terms of that sentence that they're working on, or that passage that they're reading. And that can get overloaded. It can become a bit bunged up, meaning that it's difficult for them to keep track of what they've read in terms of the comprehension. So that often is a real challenge for a lot of dyslexic children. Some dyslexic learners are actually stronger at comprehension than they are than the skills of reading in terms of the individual words. And that's because they can get a kind of gist, a bit of a general understanding of what's going on without always being able to read all the words accurately. So dyslexic learners will vary in terms of their challenges across these areas and where their skills are at. But these are some of the common things that might be difficult. A big thing for a lot of dyslexic learners in terms of accessing text is a reluctance to read. So there's lots of reasons why that might happen. For a lot of dyslexic learners, there are emotional reasons attached to being reluctant to read. So they might feel frustrated when they're struggling, and that's something we hear about a lot. It's very common that a dyslexic child feels frustrated when they're struggling. Something becomes difficult, it's not enjoyable, and then they start to feel a bit cross that they can't do it, and that other people can do it around them, or they're really, really trying hard, but it's just not working for whatever reason. So that can lead to feelings of frustration. And if that's associated with reading, then it's going to make them less keen to read, more reluctant to read. So there's lots of often feelings of frustration around reading for dyslexic learners. And some of that reluctance as well, in terms of the emotions, might come from feelings related to comparisons to peers. So in the school setting, for example, there's reading levels often, and they know what level they're on and what their peers are on, and that can often then start to have an impact on them in terms of their how they feel about themselves, their self-esteem, their confidence, and then that can make them reluctant to read because they feel like they can't do it as well. All of these things, as well as the difficulties with reading skills, often lead to dyslexic learners finding it hard to enjoy what they're reading, enjoy the process of reading, and it becomes more of a chore. It becomes something that they're doing because mum and dad want them to, because school have asked them to, because they're told to, not because they're necessarily enjoying it, because it's very difficult to get enjoyment from reading if it's a really difficult process and if you're feeling frustrated and negative about it, and it's always hard work. So lack of enjoyment is often a key one that can impact on their reluctance to read. And some dyslexic learners as well have negative experiences around reading, particularly that have affected them in terms of wanting to read. Lots of older learners, particularly in secondary school, feel very reluctant about reading aloud because they're conscious that their skills aren't as good as other people's. They're worried about getting things wrong. They're worried about their peers not supporting them with that, maybe being negative about that. So there can be some particular experiences they might have gone through that have made them feel that reading is a negative experience for them. It's not an enjoyable process, and it's something they don't want to do. In terms of reluctance to read, there's also some things around frequency of reading that are important to be aware of. So there's research that shows the positive link between reading for pleasure and the development of reading skills. So what that means is that the more we read because we enjoy it, the more likely our reading skills will develop. And that, of course, is kind of true in reverse. So if we're not reading for pleasure, we're missing that opportunity to develop our reading skills. And that can be really tricky because a lot of parents are aware of the need for regular reading, and they're encouraging that in their children. But if they're not reading for pleasure and they're not enjoying that process, then it can be really difficult to help them with that. And hopefully some of the advice I'll give you today will be supportive for that. But they're missing that opportunity to develop their reading skills. Interestingly, that research also shows a positive link between reading for pleasure and the link with other skills. So phonological skills, so that's the recognizing the sounds in words and being aware of them, and that helps with the word reading. Writing skills, grammar and spelling. So what that child is doing while they're reading for pleasure is they're taking in some of those elements of writing, of how sentences are constructed, how words are spelled. And that obviously can help them when they're using those skills themselves. So there's lots of benefits for reading for pleasure. The challenge that we might face is getting our children to that point where they are reading for pleasure and they're enjoying it. There is ways it can be done, and we can look at supporting with that, and that's what we're doing today. And the final thing I'll talk about in terms of reluctance to reading that's important is the interest levels. Sometimes children are just not interested in reading. Okay, and it might be a combination of things. It might be because they find it difficult. It might be because they're frustrated. It might be all sorts of things, but sometimes they're just not interested in it. But this can change over time. It might be because we make a few changes, a few tweaks that I'm going to suggest to you today that might be helpful, that will mean they're more interested. It might also change with age and what else is going on in their lives. I work with a really wonderful learner who, when he first came to me at a young age, had absolutely zero interest in books. Really found the process of reading and engaging with books very challenging. He's spent a long time with us building up his literacy skills, including his reading skills. And he's also had lots of encouragement over recent years to read at home. And really importantly, he's come across a series of books that suit him, that are really up his street in terms of what he's into. And what that means is that he's engaged in them now. He enjoys reading them. He wants to find out what else it happens in these books. There's a series there. He's really eager to get through them, and he really is absolutely devouring these books now. And that is a huge shift. Now, what's happened as a result is that his reading skills have improved. So as well as him enjoying reading, his reading skills are now better, which then, of course, means that he's more likely to want to read because it's not so much of a challenge. So it's that relationship of these things impacting on each other and having that cumulative, that build up impact, which is so important. I do think today's world offers a multitude of other activities which may appear more exciting than reading. So we're in the era of a lot of technology which offers very quick stimulation and interaction in terms of short videos and things, which allow our children to be entertained in a very quick, short burst way. Reading generally is an activity that requires more sustained concentration. It needs more time for things to build up. So even in short stories, there's an element of needing to wait to see what happens to build up to that exciting part of the story. There are things we can do to help with that, which I'm going to talk about, but there is an element of needing to wait. And I do think in today's society, our children are struggling with that generally. So it just, in my view, makes it more and more important that we keep the reading in and we do what we can to increase the interest, the excitement of that, so that they see that as something they want to do over and above other things, other activities which they may want to continue enjoying, but which, offer that excitement in a different way. Okay, so that's some information, some ideas from me in terms of why dyslexic learners might be reluctant to read. So how can we support these challenges? So we've got challenges potentially around reading skills and challenges around reluctance, engagement with reading. How can we support those challenges? A number of things that I want to talk to you about, some of which you'll have tried, some of which you maybe haven't. And we've got here some ideas of some very practical things you can try to support with reading skills, and then other things that you might need to go off and explore a little bit more to see what works for your child. And it is important to be aware that it is what works for your child. There is not one size fits all with these strategies, okay? So it is a matter of trying out different things. In terms of supporting weaknesses with reading skills, I mentioned earlier on, three sort of key areas. So there's phonological skills, which allows us to break down and sound out and blend new words we've not seen before, unfamiliar words. We also want to be able to support our child in terms of reading sight words. So that's words we want them to be able to recognise immediately without needing to sound out. So some examples I gave you earlier, for example, the word because, if we were to sound that out into its individual letters, b, e, k, a, s, e, does not sound like the word because. There's lots going on in there in terms of the individual letters because it's a strange spelling. We want them to be able to recognise words like that on sight, and there's different ways of approaching that. And one of the things that I think is really helpful for children to understand is that there is different approaches to reading depending on what words we're being faced with, and what we want them to have in their toolkit is those different skill sets, those different ways of attacking those words. So it's helpful, I think, to be really explicit, really clear about explaining these differences, these different approaches. So when we're reading with our child, this is one we can sound out, this one let's not sound this one out. We need to look at it in a different way, and we can approach those differently, and I'll give you some ideas for that. And then the third thing that I'll talk to you about for a little bit of time is reading comprehension and some ideas around supporting weaknesses with that. So first of all, in terms of phonological skills, the skills in terms of the sounds of the words and how we could use them, one of the things that's really challenging for dyslexic learners often is memory, short-term memory and working memory. And what that means is if your child is sounding out individual letters of a word, they're having to process lots of information, and that can be quite overwhelming. So if we take the first word that's on the screen here as an example, which is stamp, if they were to sound out all those letters individually, we've got 5 pieces of information. And that's quite a lot to process when we're putting it all back together in terms of working memory, trying to hold it in our working memory and put it back together. If we can work towards having that information grouped somehow in terms of chunks of letters, we're going to take the load off in terms of working memory and allow our child much more capacity to read that word within the context of whatever else they're reading. So we're allowing them more opportunity to be able to, for example, understand the sentence because they're not having to put as much processing resource into reading the individual word. So the example I've given you here is where we've split words into what we call their onset, that's the beginning letters, and the rhyme part, which is the end part that rhymes. So here we have st-amp, cr-amp, d-amp. And your child may not at the moment be at the point of being able to recognise things like rhyming groups and onset together. But if we can work towards that point, it will help them in terms of freeing their working memory. We would definitely need to consider here as well if our child has the ability to recognise rhyme in itself, to hear rhyme, to know what words rhyme. So we need to check that out first. If we're not sure they can, we need to do some work around that first. Otherwise, they can't use this skill to help them with reading. And rhyme and being aware of words that rhyme is a much earlier phonological skill, which they will have been introduced to in the early years in school, but for them may not be secure. And even with some much older students we work with, you'd be surprised sometimes how even, for them, rhyme is not secure and it's not a skill they can do yet, in which case that needs to be tackled first. Some just very quick examples on how you could look at something like that is, for example, using body parts to help them. So if you said, can you give me a word that rhymes with bed? And we point to our head, you're giving them a visual clue to help build up the rhyming ability. A word that rhymes with farm, arm. So you see how they can start to build up that skill, and that would be something you'd need to look at a little bit separately if they need a lot of help with that, but you can check out their rhyming ability by asking them to give you a word that rhymes with another word, and then use that to build up these skills of onset and rhyme in terms of reading. In terms of activities that then you can do to support around that, what we've got here is a couple of what we call multi-sensory activities. That means that you're engaging lots of senses. We've got hands-on activities. So at the top of the screen, we've got a picture of some word dice. And on those dice, on some of the dice is the onset letters, different letters. And on the other dice are the rhyming chunks or the end of the words. We roll 2 dice and see what we get and decide, is it a word? Does it make a real word? At the bottom, we've got an example of a memory matching game. So I've shown you the other side of the cards. What you could do is make some cards with onset on some cards and rhyme on other parts of the cards. And you keep them face down so you can't see the letters. And the child uses their memory skills to try and find matching pairs. So for example, crr and op makes crop. Does it make a real word? Yes, it does. I get to keep that pair, and they keep moving through until they find the ones that match. And what we're doing there with that sort of game as well is using and building up memory skills, which is so important for dyslexic children. So we're engaging them in the reading process, but we're also building up memory skills to help them in other ways. And notice with both these games, what we're seeing here is letters presented on cards or dice. We're not looking at word in print in a book. So we're removing that possible barrier if they're reluctant to read by turning it into a game, a hands-on activity. And these sorts of things may take some time to develop in terms of resources, but there's some strategies here for you, some guidance here from you for how you could do that. Another thing we could do in terms of decoding words we've not seen before is work towards the ability to recognise groups of letters. So this is a little bit different because we're not just talking about words that necessarily rhyme. We're looking at here an unusual pattern of letters, S-T-L-E, making sul. And that is a bit of an odd one for some children, especially if they're in that mode of wanting to sound out all the letters, because sul doesn't have the sound t in it. It's a silent letter. So rather than us try to look at it as individual letters, we might help our child to recognise that as a group of letters visually. And in the example here, we've got that group of letters highlighted. So we could sit down with our child, show them some words. They could be presented again on cards or post-it notes because they're easy to move around and quite quick and easy to get hold of, and get them to highlight that part of the word to start recognising it as a group of letters, that then when we see it within a word, we separate that part out, and it makes the process of breaking up that word more simple, because we've got sul, we know is one piece of information, and we've just got to look at the first part to see what that might be. Here we've got a similar example, but here we've got a suffix, which is suffix full. A suffix is a group of letters added onto the end of a word to change its meaning somehow. In this case, the suffix full, which is often a confusing one because it's not spelt the same as the word full. So we look at this in our teaching structure as a separate area we look at, separate area of learning. Here we've got some pictures to support what these things mean, and we're matching them up and we're highlighting the words. So we're doing lots of things to look at the visual pattern of letters in that word. And in much longer words, suffixes are a really helpful tool to help a child break up longer words. So if we can chop off the suffix straight away, we can cover it up with our finger, we can have a piece of card that we cover it up with, we're left with a lot less to contend with. So if we take that bottom example, spoonful, a lot of children might look at that and think it's a really long word and start to sound it out because it looks a bit challenging. If we could visually cover up suffix full and say to them, we're going to cover that part up because we know that that's a separate part, then they may well be able to recognise spoon on its own, because it's a lot less to take in terms of information in it. Quite possibly a word they've seen before, or containing patterns of letters that they're more comfortable with, they're more confident in. So that's another example of something you can do in terms of building up those phonological skills. I mentioned that sight words we would want to potentially tackle separately. So there's lots of things we can do around that. And we've got another good example of that on the screen here with the Duplo bricks, the word you, Y-O-U. Again, we cannot sound that out because it wouldn't make any sense to say you and then blend them together. Doesn't make the word you. So we've got to tackle it separately somehow. So Duplo or Lego is a really great way of doing this because it's very practical, it's hands-on. We can give the child just those combination of letters to put together. This will also potentially help with their spelling as well. And one of the things that's really great about Lego and Duplo is because the bricks only stick one way, you're encouraging and supporting possible confusion with reversals of letters. So in the case of the Y, we couldn't stick it on the other way around, so it wouldn't fit. With a B and a D, it can only stick on one way. So you're helping with that side of things as well, if reversal of letters is something that your child has some challenges with. We could also look at matching games, and I mentioned that previously in terms of the word matching, but you could also look at picture matching. So can we match up the word with pictures and have it as a memory matching game to help them recognise these words? Another example of how we might help with sight words is displaying them around the house in places where they're going to be seen often. So a good example of that for it is brushing your teeth in the morning. They've got to stand there and normally they're looking at the mirror or something in front of them, maybe the wall. If there's a couple of post-it notes there with those words stuck on, then they're getting to see it. You could maybe get them to make a little jigsaw with the words, and then that gets stuck on the wall because then they've done that activity and they're sticking it up. So the more we can get them to engage with those letters and create them themselves, these visual aids, the more likely they are to remember them, because it's going to go into their memory more efficiently, into their long-term memory. And we're trying to make links there between the information and and getting it back out of their memory. I said we'd talk a little bit about reading comprehension. It's obviously a massive area, so I'm not going to spend ages on this, but just a few ideas in terms of how we can support with reading comprehension skills. Some of those things I've already talked about with the word reading skills and the decoding skills will be important because it takes the load off in terms of understanding and reading longer passages. So as I mentioned previously, the working memory then has got more processing resources left to support understanding what they're reading. So think about it a bit like, computer screen. If you've got lots of windows open, it starts to slow down. So if we can shut some of those windows, we can minimize that information, for example, by making the decoding less of a task. There's more processing resources left for actually understanding what they're reading. On the picture on the screen on the left, we've got a magazine with lots of post-it notes on there. And in this case, it's coded. They're coded by colour. What information we're looking for is coded in terms of the colour of the post-it notes. Some examples on the right of things that you could ask verbally, but we could have it backed up on post-it notes. So how has this happened? Why is it happening? Where is it happening? What is happening and to who? So some really simple questions that could help your child start to pull out information. And this could be a piece of an information text like this one here, the history of Minecraft. It could be a story. So at key points or regularly during that story, we can stop and ask questions. And that's quite a key thing as well, is to not try and get through too much of the book maybe before we ask some of these questions. We don't need to be asking lots of questions at every stage, but let's just have a pause. Okay, so what's happened? Can we just summarise that? Who's done what and why? And maybe ask some questions around what might happen next. Why do you think that? So start to build in some of those prediction skills, those inference skills. You could also ask some questions which encourage visualization of the story. If there isn't pictures in there, what do you think that character would look like? Why is that? What might they be wearing? And these sorts of things help to engage them in the story as well as build up their comprehension skills. So it's making it more interesting for them, more exciting than just sitting and reading a piece of text that they might be finding challenging. Cloze activities, spelled CLOZE, are really helpful for reading comprehension in a different way. And there's lots of these available online that you can find to download and print off. So here we've got one that's about fish, and we've got a box of words at the top. And if we provide a box of words to put into these spaces below, then we're giving them more of a structured way of doing this. If your child needs a bit more challenge and you feel they're ready for it, you could provide no words for the spaces and ask them to come up with their own words for those spaces, and that would be a bit more challenging. So we've got some sentences and we've got some words missing, and we're asking them to decide what word goes in the space to show that they understand what's happening in this piece of text. So cloze activities can be a really nice supported way of looking at a bigger piece of text without it being too overwhelming. And we've got, short pieces of information. So we're not having to try and get through lots of chapters in a book. We've just got a short piece of information, but we're building up the skills. So as I say, you can Google these and you find some online that can be really helpful. So the other big area I talked about was reluctance to read. And that's what we're going to look at next in terms of how we can support with that. So first of all, something you might find helpful is carrying out a reading for pleasure audit. And this has come from the World Book Day resources, so you can find this online. And what you're looking at here are what is considered to be 6 reading for pleasure behaviours which are important at home and at school. So what you might find here when you have this conversation with your child is that there might be some things you weren't aware of that are gaps for them that might help to address why they're reluctant to read. So at home, for example, are they being read to regularly? Have we stopped doing that because we're too busy or they don't seem like they're engaged? That can be a really important activity that helps with reading for pleasure. So if we're not doing that, Can we do more of it? And there are some ways that we can adapt that if it's a challenge for you as a parent to read to your child, or it's difficult in terms of fitting that in. There are some things we can do to adapt that I'll talk about in a minute. For example, things like audiobooks where they're listening to the story. So it doesn't have to be a person reading to them. However, if it's person reading to them with a book in front of them, that can be really helpful in terms of them seeing the print and seeing the story, the words on the page as well. But there's ways of adapting that if that's going to be a challenge. Are they being read to regularly at school? Do you know if they are? Can we talk to school about that? Is there more opportunities for that? If not, that might be helpful. Second thing on the reading for pleasure audit is having books. So do they have books at home that they've got choice about reading? And at school, is there books available? At home, there are ways we can improve that, and I'll talk to you about some of that in a minute, particularly around resources like the library. Having books in the home and around the home is really important for encouraging enjoyment of reading and access to books. Having a choice in what you read is next on the reading for pleasure audit, which is really important. So that often from parents that we meet, we know is a challenge in school, partly sometimes because of the reading skills of your child. So they're having challenges with reading, therefore they're limited in which books they can access at school. And that means sometimes they're reading the same books over and over, which of course becomes a bit tedious, and they're lacking enjoyment in terms of accessing the right sorts of books. And at home, that also relates to the types of books we've got available, and maybe exploring some different types of books, as I say, for example, through the library. At school, in terms of choice, I'll talk to you in a minute about a good way that might be improved if you're able to sort of support your school with that and have that conversation with your school. At home, it's important to find time to read. Key one, I think, in today's modern world where we're all very busy a lot of the time, and it can be one of those activities that might get overlooked. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a minute in terms of some other information that I think is helpful to consider. Another thing to maybe have a conversation with your child about is, do they feel they've got trusted help to find a book at home, at school? Is there somebody able to guide them with that? If that's not happening at school, could you have that conversation with school to say they don't feel they've got that help, they need a bit of guidance? And finally, making reading fun. Is it fun for them at home? Is it fun at school? I've talked to you about a few ways we might increase the fun levels, but we'll do a bit more of that in a minute in terms of some of these alternatives to text, reading traditional forms of text. Is there ways we can make it more fun? So I mentioned briefly making time for reading, and one of the things that's really important to consider here is the reading environment. So where are you asking your child to read, and when are you asking them to read? So for a lot of people, I know that the reading routine is bedtime. They were read to their child when they were younger and in bed, and then that happens again as they get older. It continues to stay there. So for them, that may be quite appropriate in terms of the environment. Is it, a comfortable environment? Is it a calm environment? Other people may be trying to fit reading into other times of the day in different places that may be not quite as appropriate or helpful for your child. So are they being asked to read their school book in the kitchen where there's other children around or other things going on, and it might be quite a busy environment with lots of noise? It might be more difficult for them to concentrate. Is that then giving them more challenges in terms of reading? So just think about the reading environment that you're asking them to read in. Could we establish a separate place for that that's away from those busy things? Maybe it's away from bedtime, because maybe they want bedtime to be something separate, particularly if reading for them at the moment is a challenge and it's something they're reluctant to do. They may not want bedtime associated with that. So could we think, is there another space we could create in the house with a couple of cushions, maybe some soft lights, to help them feel it's a separate environment and it's a more calm and cozy place to read? Another key thing is, when are you asking your child to read? And as I say, a lot of people are looking at bedtime as the time to do that. Now, for a lot of children, that can be helpful in terms of relaxing for bed. But if they're being asked to read and they find it frustrating, tiring, challenging, difficult, then at bedtime that may be even more of a challenge, because they're potentially quite tired at the end of the day, and they may not have the skills, the energy, the resources left for tackling that process effectively. There are ways we can support with that, and I'll talk about some of those in a minute. So, for example, taking turns with reading, so they're not doing all of it. But just consider when we're asking them to read, is that the best time of the day for them? Are there other times of the day or the week which might be more helpful for them, away from some of those other things that are happening? Conversely, some people might be asking their child to try and fit in their reading book before school while they're having breakfast and other things are going on. Does it feel like it's a bit of a squish to get it in? Do they feel a bit of pressure that they've not got enough time to read it? Just think carefully about when you're asking them to read. Building confidence, I think, is really important in terms of supporting with that eagerness to read generally, because for a lot of dyslexic children, they're facing challenges across the school day. They're often being asked to do things that are not where their strengths lie. So it can be quite hard for them, and generally to have confidence in certain things, particularly for a lot of children, they are lacking confidence in their reading skills. They know that it's difficult and they become frustrated with it. So then they're lacking confidence. So a few things that can help with that is turn taking, which I mentioned briefly a minute ago. So them not having to read all of the text, you taking turns reading parts of it. You could even turn that into a family game where you're taking turns. You could take turns and act out parts of the book, make it more fun, make it less about the reading and more about the story or whatever it is that they're actually accessing. All of those things might help them to build their confidence. They're not feeling it's on them all the time. Generally, consider how you're recognizing effort and success, and that might be to do with their reading efforts, their reading attempts. It might be just little few words that say, well done, you know, you did that part really well. It might be more formal recognition of that. So you might decide to have some sort of reward scheme in place for them in regular reading, in order to encourage them. Also, you know, think about other strengths they've got outside of reading. If reading's something they're finding difficult, what else are they good at that we can celebrate and allow them to keep being good at and have opportunities for, so that generally their confidence is growing, and then they feel more confident to do some of the things that are more difficult for them. So that's just about recognizing strengths in other areas and success in other areas as well. I've talked a few times about some alternatives to traditional forms of text, so things we can look at to make reading more engaging and less about accessing books, which for some children are a real barrier because they just feel really put off by books. So audiobooks are a fantastic form of support. You can get audiobooks for free at Calibre Audio, which we will send you through the link for. If your child is dyslexic, you simply tick a box to say they're dyslexic and you get free access to a whole host of books. Audiobooks have been shown to continue to increase vocabulary, understanding of sentence construction, things like grammar. So those benefits don't just come through reading in print. They can be increased by accessing audiobooks as well. And what it often means is that your child is able to access information or stories that they otherwise wouldn't be able to access because perhaps their reading skills are not strong enough to access some of those books. So a sort of typical example of that might be Harry Potter, very complex books to read, lots of complicated words and names and made up words that can be really tricky, but your child might really enjoy those stories. And audiobooks can be a great way to support that reading process alongside accessing text. And I mentioned, you know, for listening, being read to, audiobooks can be great if we've not got the time or we struggle with reading ourselves. They can be a great way to fill time in things like travel when we're moving around in the car or in other traveling to other places. Having subtitles turned on, either on YouTube videos or the TV or whatever your child's accessing, can be a helpful tool for some, not for all, and not everybody likes having this, but it can be a great way to support with reading skills because the child then is hearing and seeing the words at the same time. Cooking instructions are great in terms of reading as an alternative to traditional forms of text like books, because often the words, the information is more condensed, there's less of it, and you're engaging your child in a practical activity at the same time, which often can take the onus off them feeling they're having to read and take the attention away from it being a reading activity, turning it into something practical. And there are some really nice things online that you can access in terms of recipes. There's a sort of example on here. It's a little bit small for you to see, but it has pictures alongside the words. So then they're building up their knowledge of reading those words alongside having a bit of support with reading because they can see the pictures. So that might be a fun way of increasing reading skills in just incorporating reading within other activities. Signs that we see out and about and encouraging our children to have a go at reading signs can be really helpful. Street signs are good, but they're often tricky because they include things like street names, and names are often hard to decode and read. So other signs are helpful. The one here is to do with toilet use, but things you see in shops, restaurants. Ask your child, can we read that? What does it say? Celebrate when they manage to read it right. Give them some help if they're struggling. But those sorts of common high frequency words that you often see out and about might be really helpful just to be aware of in our environment. And another thing that can be really helpful is word games. So there's lots of word games out there like Boggle. The word escapes me right now. Articulate. There's word search games that are all hands-on board games. Story cubes are good, which are not to do with reading directly, but they're to do with building up the stories. All these things that are to do with words and language and letters that can really help to make that side of things more of a fun process and less about trying to read a sentence in a book or on a piece of paper, and more about generally playing with words, playing with letters, and finding some enjoyment in that can be really helpful. I talked earlier on about interest and how that can be a barrier as well. So some ideas, some suggestions here of how we might support with that before we finish. So Kindle book readers from Amazon are really great for a number of reasons. And what I'm talking about here is the Kindle Paperwhite ones that are designed to look like a book rather than the Kindle tablets with a screen. And the reason I say that is because there's a lot more functionality with the Kindle book readers, and they don't give you that glare that a screen does that can be, potentially a little bit harmful for children's eye development, that sort of thing. So Kindles are great because you've got access to a really wide choice of books. There's absolutely thousands and thousands of books stored in there. That also allows you to access samples of books, and Amazon Kindles offer you big samples like a full chapter of a book to see if is it a book that your child will enjoy in terms of content? Is it at the right level for them? And having that sample to try out can be really helpful. And the other thing that Kindle does then, once you've read a book, is it suggests other books that you might like. So it might be books by the same author, it might be books that are along a similar interest level. So that's great because it's giving you access to and suggestions of other books. Kindles are great in terms of lots of display options. That means you can customize it to how you want. And so for a lot of readers, that helps because they can make the text bigger. And lots of dyslexic learners find small text quite off-putting. And if the text is bigger, we're going to get through the pages quicker because there's less on the page. So it also can help build up the confidence that they feel, oh, I've turned a page here. I've moved on to the next page. They feel that they're reading more, even though the amount of text they're reading, the amount on the page is less, but it feels like they're getting through the pages more quickly. So that can be really confidence boosting. What I would say in terms of Kindles is just to be aware that they're not brilliant for books with pictures. The display is not in colour. It's designed to look like a book, a sort of grey colour really. So it's not great for books with lots of images. Generally, it tends to be better for books with text and maybe a few images thrown in. Another thing that can be really helpful in terms of increasing interest is comics and graphic text, graphic novels. So comics are great because the images break up the text, which means they require less sustained concentration, and often they contain lots of short stories. So the reader is getting to the end of the story and getting that excitement, that interest more quickly than they would in a book potentially. Visually, they're often really interesting, so lots to see, and we know that often our dyslexic learners love the visual side of things. They're more interested in pictures and practical doing, and so the picture side of it can be really engaging. And often the other thing that's helpful about comics is that they can link to interests. So an example we've got on here is the Lego magazine, Lego Junior magazine, which is free to subscribe to, has lots of ideas in there about Lego that you can build, but it also has short stories and things. So that's just engaging your child in a form of text, an interest that they might have, without it needing to be a big long print form. A couple of other examples on here are the Phoenix magazine, which is an online subscription, and the Week Junior. The Phoenix is a comics book story, which is absolutely jam-packed full of stories and comics, comic strips, all very different in style. One of the things I love about it is it doesn't have any adverts in there. So it's not like some of the ones you get in the shops where every couple of pages it's about trying to sell them a toy. It's just jam-packed with stories and lovely illustrations, so it can be a really nice one. The Week Junior is essentially a newspaper in a magazine for children. So if you've got a child who's more interested in information than they are stories, it could be a really lovely way for them to access that. Lots of images in their photos that are really engaging as well. On the other side, we've got a graphic novel, in this case, Hamlet. A graphic novel is essentially a novel that's been turned into a comic strip. And so this can be quite helpful, particularly if your dyslexic child is older, because they might have trouble accessing something like Hamlet, which is quite a complex text at school. And if they can access it in this form, this format, where they've got pictures interspersed and it's more like a comic strip, then it may allow them to understand that story a bit better before they get on to having to read the full novel at school, for example. So there's lots of advantages to these comics and graphic novels that might be helpful for you to explore. Barrington Stoke are a book publisher who design books specifically for dyslexic children. So they're a great one to check out if you haven't already. And I mentioned briefly earlier how you might encourage your school if their choice of books is not that great. This one could be a great one that they could look at, and maybe you could support with that in terms of some fundraising through the school's PTA to get some books. They're dyslexia friendly visually, which means that they're on often cream or dull paper rather than white. And they often have larger text and more images to break up the text. They are also adapted to suit the reading age and the interest age of the child. And by that, I mean that a lot of children are interested in things but can't access the text for that age, their interest age, because of their skills being lower in terms of their reading age. So what Barrington Stoke offer is lots and lots of books that are aimed at children's interest age, but with a lower reading age, so they can still access things that they will find engaging and interesting, but which are at the right age level for them. And you can filter that on their website. So you can filter by reading age and interest age. If you're not too sure what your child's reading age is, but you know their skills are weak, you can just sort of take a general rough guide that they're a couple of years below maybe, and try out some of those books. And Barrington Stoke have lots of samples available online. So if you find a book, and actually I would say if you and your child find a book, best thing is to look together, find a book that looks of interest, give it a go, try to read it, see how they get on. Is there a little bit of a challenge? Because we want a little bit of challenge. We don't want them to be able to read every word with absolute ease, because that might then mean we're not going to develop their skills. But if they're having to stop really quite frequently, throughout the reading to decode words they don't know, then that's going to be too tricky. So just see how they get on, and if that isn't right, then we might need to adapt the reading age one way or the other. The other thing that I would urge you to consider in terms of interest is your local library. There's loads of good stuff going on in the libraries in terms of encouraging reading, and generally being in that environment with lots of books, lots of choice, and often they have quite comfortable seating areas to sit around in and have a look at books, can encourage a positive feeling towards books. So just being immersed in that environment. Obviously, there's lots of choice available in libraries to browse and to have a look at. Often there's some really interesting people in libraries that work there as well that can support with that. And they also have audiobooks available for free via their Borrow Box scheme. So the Borrow Box scheme is free ebooks and audiobooks via the library. So accessing those audiobooks that I mentioned earlier that you can get from other places as well for free to support with that enjoyment of listening to books. Okay, so I really hope that has helped in terms of giving you some ideas with supporting reading at home, understanding maybe a bit more about why your child is finding it a challenge, and then addressing some of those specific concerns for them. Our support group next month is all to do with a assistive technology called Sensory Readable, which is a toolbar that can support your child with reading and literacy skills, reading and writing. And that's happening in April. So if you'd like to find out a bit more about that, head over to our Facebook group where we'll be advertising that session for you to sign up for free and find out a bit more about that software. But otherwise, I thank you for your attention listening today, and I hope that it's been helpful. And if there's anything else we can do, please get in touch.